on the last Sunday in the series we've been doing for July. We're talking about the religions of the world. And the topic today is basic Islam. I'm going to start out with a little history. I promise not to bore you too much, but I'm fascinated by history. And when it comes to Islam, since it is the youngest of the four major religions, it's probably much better documented than a lot of the other faiths are. Islam came into the world through an Arab merchant named Muhammad. It's the year 610. There's no Europe yet, just a bunch of Saxons and Angles and Visigoths and Ostrogoths and Franks who were gradually taking over what was left of the Roman Empire, which was disintegrating at about that time. You know, they call those people barbarians. And I have to take exception because if you are of Northern European descent like me, those are our people. How dare we call them barbarians? But they were the ones that eventually took over. But in the meantime, it was a lawless mess. And things weren't much better where Muhammad was trying to do business in the Middle East, the Arabian Peninsula. It was a tribal society, no centralized government. The harshness of desert life resulted in institutionalized raiding and plundering among the tribes. There were blood feuds that lasted for decades. And Anne was right when she mentioned earlier that it's kind of hard to find Islamic jokes, but there is a wealth of Arabic folklore going way back. You know, the tales of 1,000 nights, 1,001 nights, I think it is. All of that comes to us from Arabic folklore, which is very rich. And there's one story from Arabic folklore in particular talking about this idea of the blood feud. There was a man who returned to his village after an absence of several days, and he met up with his best friend, and they sat down to drink tea. And he says to his friend, "Do you remember the man who offended me 25 years ago?" And the friend says, "Well, certainly." And he says, "Well, I killed him 2 days ago." And there's a long pause, and the friend says, "Why were you in such a hurry?" Based in some truth. And even in the big cities like Mecca, there was no central government. And so back in that time, around the year 610, the place resembled what we would probably recognize as the Wild Wild West over here. Lots of lawlessness, drunkenness. They gambled on everything and anything. And there was nothing really that provided what you might call a moral or ethical framework. They worshipped all sorts of different gods. They had a belief in these desert spirits that were called jinn, which we now know as genies. And these genies could go either way. They could bless you or they could curse you. That was the world that Muhammad was born into, and he didn't like it. No, sir, he didn't like it one bit. He didn't want to live like that. He couldn't believe that it was normal for a society to be so crude, superstitious, and violent. So he took up the practice of going to a cave in a desert mountain known as Hira, and he would meditate on the nature of good and evil, much like many of the philosophers and sages and founders of the other world religions would do. They would sit and meditate on the nature of good and evil. And so it was while he was meditating in this cave that he started to experience this series of revelations that he said were given to him by an angel, which he believed to be Gabriel. And over the next 23 years, those revelations were written down by Muhammad's followers, and they became the Quran. And the Quran, the production of the Quran, the way that the Quran came into existence, is the only miracle that Muslims believe in. So Muhammad started preaching based on his revelations, and he was not received very well because his teachings were a threat to the powers that be. When I say powers, I'm talking about the people that worshiped the many different gods that were in existence at the time. The idea of one God was a threat to the economy of Mecca because Mecca relied on All of these different people coming in and worshiping at the different shrines to all of these gods. There was something like 360 shrines in Mecca. So we're talking about some big bucks here with people coming in to visit those shrines. His moral teachings, of course, meant the end of gambling and drinking and prostitution, which also produced a lot of money, not to mention the fact that lots of people seemed to really enjoy those things. So they were mad at him too. So Muhammad was this social reformer, bringing in these ideas that he received through meditation. But more than that, he also insisted that in the eyes of God, all people were equal. And that was a huge threat to the power structure, because as we know, a lot of ancient power structures, well, not ancient, today as well, power structures always require some group or group of people to be on the bottom, so to speak, and they're usually exploited. So he wasn't popular in Mecca, and as a result he had to leave Mecca, and he set up his home base in the neighboring town of Medina. And that's where he started attracting followers. And he had a message that was very appealing to oppressed people, and it still does today. It appealed to those who felt left out. It appealed to the people that felt that they were in that exploited and oppressed class of people. And eventually, Medina became prosperous, it became powerful, and the people of Mecca took a look at it and said, well, this is starting to become a threat to us, so they sent an army from Mecca to Medina to take him out and his followers once and for all. And that was when the battle began. And it was a long battle. It took years, but Muhammad and the people of Medina, they withstood a siege. They drove the armies back to Mecca, and then they took Mecca itself. And within 2 years after that, all of Arabia was under his control, and the rest, as they say, is history. Islam became one of the two major world religions that were born in warfare and conquest. The other one being, of course, Judaism and their military conquest of the Promised Land. Similar beginnings. Now, a couple of weeks ago, I introduced you to this gentleman here, Houston Smith, who wrote this wonderful book. If you want to learn about the world religions, this is the book to get. The World's Religions, Houston Smith. Here's what he had to say about Islam. He said, Islam is the most difficult religion for the West to understand. No part of the world, an American columnist has written, is more hopelessly, systematically, and stubbornly misunderstood by us than that complex of religion, culture, and geography known as Islam. And again, similar to what we call the Hindu religion, Islam is a complex of different cultures and different sects of the Islamic faith. There's no Islamic pope. There's no central authority that speaks for every Muslim in the world. Now, if you want some examples, he was talking about hopeless, systematic, and stubborn misunderstanding. If you're looking for some examples of that, you don't really have to look very far. Most of the time, the way we see it manifesting is as a form of hypocrisy or double standard, right? Things that are perfectly okay for us to do in our culture become bad when someone from an Islamic culture does that same thing. A few years ago, for example, people were up in arms protesting about a group of American citizens. This is in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. They wanted to build an Islamic center on property that they owned, which was properly zoned for such things. And it became a huge court fight. Now here's a few pictures of the different kinds of protests that people were mounting, marching, and things like that. And it became this huge court fight. I would imagine that this court fight took care of a lot of lawyers' boat payments over the years. And the center was eventually built. The center was eventually built and then promptly vandalized. So let's turn the tables for a moment and try to imagine a group of atheists or secular humanists protesting say, a Baptist center or a Catholic cathedral, people would be screaming First Amendment as if that same First Amendment religious freedom didn't apply to people of the Islamic faith. When it comes to Islam, I guess, well, people have a problem with some of the things in the Quran. For instance, Muslims are supposed to go out and convert unbelievers. I mean, who ever heard of such a thing? I mean, can you imagine Christians going to another country and converting people by force and then erecting churches and cathedrals there? How about this one? Can you imagine Christians going door to door in a nice, quiet neighborhood trying to talk people into going to church? It's a stretch. Can you imagine Jewish people going into a land occupied by another culture and taking it by force and imposing their religious laws there? Okay, so maybe that's not a good reason to single out Islam, but then they say, what about all of this? What about all of the violent stuff in the Quran? People single it out. The Quran promotes violence and aggression, and you can indeed go through the Quran and come up with some passages which are very violent. Listen to this. Then I saw heaven opened, and there was a white horse. Its rider is called Faithful and True, and in righteousness he judges and makes war. His eyes are like a flame of fire. He is clothed in a robe dipped in blood. And his name is called the Word of God. And the armies of heaven, wearing fine linen, white and pure, were following him on white horses. From his mouth comes a sharp sword with which to strike down the nations. And he will rule them with a rod of iron. He will tread the winepress of the fury of the wrath of God the Almighty. On his robe and on his thigh he has a name inscribed, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Terrible stuff, right? It's not the Quran. That's the book of Revelation in the Bible. The guy on the horse is Jesus. And that's just a small part of a long list of similar passages that you'll find in the Bible. For example, 1 Samuel, God tells Saul to attack the Amalekites. And here's what he tells him to do. He says, now go and smite Amalek and utterly destroy all they have and spare them not, but slay both man and woman, infant and suckling, ox and sheep, camel and ass, and so on. So genocide, scorched earth. The Hebrew word for that is herem, total annihilation that's commanded by God. If God commands it, it's okay to do it. Christianity has its own version of herem. During the Crusades in the Middle Ages, the Catholic popes declared the Muslims the Amalekites. As long as you applied that label to them, they're the Amalekites, it becomes okay. We had the great religious wars of the 16th, 17th, and 19th centuries. Protestants and Catholics each believed that the other side were the Amalekites and should be utterly destroyed. The Bible drove a great deal of violence in this country and around the world. In fact, I would say it's probably far more bloody than the Quran. So, the sacred scriptures of the world have more than enough violence to go around. And as far as I'm concerned, there's nothing sacred about that. Nobody should get a prize for that. And in the hands of an extremist, a fundamentalist, an extremist, a nationalist, Christian, Jew, or Muslim, those things can be very dangerous, those passages. But the fact is that Christians and Jews have, for the most part, given up the kind of institutionalized violence that we see being promoted by extremist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS and the Taliban and so on. So how do we explain that difference? Well, there's a professor formerly at Penn State who's been studying that problem, Professor Philip Jenkins. He's an expert on the subject, and this is what he has to say on the subject. He says, what happens in all religions as they grow and mature and expand, they go through a process of forgetting the original violence. And I call this a process of holy amnesia. I like that, holy amnesia. They make the violence symbolic. Wiping out the enemy becomes wiping out one's own sins. Well, Islam is going through that process right now. And we need to remember that Islam is around 600 years younger than Christianity. So from an evolutionary standpoint, it's happening. It's a process. It may take a little bit longer, but it helps to keep things in perspective. When I talk about perspective, we have to remember that there is something like, and these numbers may be old, like 1.2 billion Muslims in the world. Al-Qaeda, at its peak, had maybe 30,000 fighters. Think of that as a percentage of 1.2 billion. I mean, it's nothing as a percentage of that population. But we still have the voices out there who are trying to tell us that we're facing some sort of a cataclysmic battle of cultures. Islam versus the West. The truth is that the biggest battle is between the radical factions within Islam. Islamic extremists have killed more Muslims than non-Muslims, and they continue to do so, just like Christians did during the Inquisition and the Reformation and all of those different things. In fact, I would argue that Christianity during the Crusades and the Inquisition made, oh, you got to add the witch hunts in there too, they made Al-Qaeda and ISIS look fairly benign in comparison to what was going on. Every culture, every religion has had to face its own demons of extremism, fundamentalism, and violence in the name of a God. And history shows us that in the long run, the voices of reason, free thought, and progressive values have won out. Our American culture has seen the same thing and has been through it too. The problem is that we who are not part of that culture can't impose those things on them. We have to support them in finding that within, in finding it for themselves and letting the process be what it has to be within those cultures. That's difficult. In Unity, we like to do something called holding the high watch. And that means that we look at the negative events of the world from an evolutionary perspective. It's a long view, it's a grand view. We hold on to a vision of the eventual shift in consciousness that leads from violence to peace. And if we know where to look, and if we're patient, and if we do that persistently, we can see it happening. A part of keeping the high watch means we look for the good news. Not always easy. It's out there, but it does tend to be drowned out by the powers that be who thrive on outrage and fear and division. One example, back in 2017, for some reason in this country, Jewish cemeteries were being vandalized at an alarming rate. This headline is something we should remember. Muslim Americans offer to stand guard at Jewish sites across the U.S. to prevent vandalism. This was started out by a Muslim American Marine Corps veteran who tried to organize his fellow Muslims in a group that would, if needed, go and stand guard at these cemeteries. That was the offer that was put out there. Last year, you might recall in October, that synagogue in Pittsburgh that was attacked. All the people that were killed. I think maybe this headline might have gone by without a lot of fanfare. Muslim Americans raised more than $200,000 for those affected by Pittsburgh synagogue shooting. We just want to know what you need. If it's people outside your next service protecting you, let us know. We'll be there, in addition to the money. This year, and we can see this kind of thing rolling on and on, back and forth. This year we had the mosque attacks that were in Christchurch, New Zealand. 51 killed, not by an Islamic extremist this time, but by a white nationalist. Now the Pittsburgh synagogue is responding to them. Let's see if we got this one here. Pittsburgh Jewish group raises money for New Zealand Muslim community after mosque shootings. That's how it should work. That's how it can work, and I think we can expect to see more of the same. As long as this information keeps getting out there and raising consciousness, that's what we can expect. So I think the good news here is that as long as everyone keeps focused on ways to get along, we'll get along. It'll work. And getting along starts with promoting understanding. That's what we're doing with this series here. So that's it for world religions. Next month we'll be shifting our focus to what I like to call essential unity ideas. And that would be in honor of our co-founders who were both born in August. So we'll do that starting next week. See you then. Thank you.